I set my fork down very slowly, the way you do when you're trying not to let your hands shake. My son was still laughing. His wife was laughing too. That practiced, polished laugh she saved for moments when she wanted everyone in the room to know she was better than the situation. Victor was chuckling into his wine glass, the big gold watch on his wrist catching the light from the chandelier my son had installed, specifically because Victor had one just like it in his dining room. My ex-wife Patricia touched her pearls and smiled the way she always did when she was pretending not to be pleased about something she was very, very pleased about. And I said nothing, not a single word. My son Derek had just told 12 people sitting around his holiday table, his neighbors, the Hendersons, his wife's parents, 2 of his colleagues from work, Patricia, Victor, and our granddaughter Lily, that I was, and I am quoting him directly, kind of an embarrassment to bring anywhere. He had been explaining why he hadn't invited me to his company's Christmas gala the week before. He said it laughing, the way people say cruel things when they want to pretend they're being honest instead of mean. He said Victor had come instead. He said Victor knew how to work a room. He said Victor had connections that actually mattered. He said all of this at his own dinner table, with a glass of Bordeaux in his hand that I had been quietly paying for every month for the last 4 years. I picked up my fork again. I finished my meal. I thanked his wife Cassandra for the lamb, which was honestly a little overcooked, and I drove home in my 2019 Subaru Outback through the December cold with the heater running and the radio off. The house I drove home to is not impressive from the outside. That is intentional. It is a 3-bedroom colonial in a quiet part of Westerville, Ohio, with a 2-car garage and a yard I mow myself in the summer. The neighbors think I'm a retired engineer who lives modestly. They are half right. I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, sat in the chair by the window, and looked at the snow coming down in the streetlights, and I thought about my son very carefully. I thought about all the calculations I had been running in the background of every interaction with him for the past several years, the way an accountant keeps a second set of books, and somewhere around the 3rd sip of bourbon, I made a decision that I had been postponing for a long time. I picked up my phone and called Walter. Walter Grimes has been my attorney for 21 years, he answered on the 2nd ring, because Walter always answers on the 2nd ring no matter what time it is, which is one of the reasons I pay him very well. I told him I needed to see him Monday morning. I told him to clear his schedule. I told him to pull every document that had my son's name on it. Walter said, "All of them?" I said, "All of them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have everything ready." I finished my bourbon and went to bed and slept better than I had in years. Let me tell you about my son Derek, because understanding him requires understanding where he came from and what I did wrong, and I have had a great deal of time to sit with what I did wrong. Derek is 38 years old. He is tall and good-looking the way his mother is good-looking, with her dark eyes and her easy confidence in rooms full of people. He graduated from Ohio State with a business degree that I paid for, and then he got an MBA from a school in Chicago that I also paid for, and then he joined a mid-sized marketing firm called Crestline Group, where he worked his way up to Senior Director of Brand Strategy, which sounds more impressive than it is, or it did, until you understand certain things about Crestline Group that Derek never bothered to look into very carefully. Cassandra is his wife. They married 6 years ago. She grew up in Westchester County, New York, and she has never fully forgiven Ohio for existing. She is not a bad person, not exactly, but she has organized her entire identity around the idea of ascending, and unfortunately she decided early on that I was not part of the ascent. I do not hold this against her the way I probably should. She wanted a certain kind of life, and she thought she knew exactly what that life looked like and which people belonged in it. I did not look like I belonged in it. That was, as it turned out, a catastrophic miscalculation. Patricia and I divorced 11 years ago. It was not a vicious divorce, not exactly, but it was thorough. She got the house in Upper Arlington that we'd lived in for 20 years, a settlement that I agreed to without argument. And she got primary custody of a narrative that cast me as the workaholic who had been too focused on his engineering projects and his quiet investments to be a real husband. She was not entirely wrong about this, but she was not entirely right either. We are not people who should have been married to each other. I understood this about 15 years into the marriage, and I think she understood it around the same time, and we kept going anyway for reasons that made sense to us at the time and seem harder to explain now. Victor Calloway entered her life 2 years after the divorce. Victor owns 4 steakhouse restaurants in Columbus and 1 in Cincinnati, and he drives a Cadillac Escalade and wears suits that cost more than most people's car payments. He is, in the specific way that Derek admires and I find exhausting, exactly what success is supposed to look like on the outside. Victor announces himself in every room he enters. Victor has opinions about wine that he shares whether or not anyone has asked. Victor once told me, at Lily's 9th birthday party, that I seemed like a man who had never really pushed himself. I smiled and helped Lily cut her birthday cake. The thing about Victor is that he does not know anything about me. Neither does Patricia. Neither, and this is the part that matters, does Derek. This is not an accident. When I was 34 years old, working as a senior engineer at a manufacturing company in Columbus, I developed a process optimization system that the company licensed, used, and then, when I eventually left, lost access to. The patents are mine. They were always mine, because I had been very careful about exactly that. Over the following decades, those patents have generated licensing fees from 11 different companies in 5 different countries. I have had the same accountant for 30 years. I have had the same investment advisor for 22. I drive a 2019 Subaru Outback and mow my own lawn, and I do not own a gold watch, and I have never once felt the need to announce myself in a room. I am not going to tell you exactly what I am worth, because that is not the point. The point is that Derek has spent the last 6 years allowing his wife and his stepfather to convince him that his actual father is a small, unimpressive man with a modest retirement who ought to be grateful for a seat at the holiday table. The point is that every single advantage Derek has in his life runs through me. He does not know this. He has never known this, because I protected him from knowing it. Because I thought, and I was wrong about this, I will say it plainly. I thought that letting him believe he had built his own life would make him into a man with the backbone to actually build his own life. Instead, it made him comfortable. Instead, it made him the kind of man who sits at a dinner table with a glass of wine that his father is paying for and tells 12 people that his father is an embarrassment. Monday morning, I sat across from Walter in his office on High Street, and we went through everything. There was the Crestline Group piece first, because that was the most significant. 8 years ago, when Derek was still climbing through the junior ranks at Crestline, I was approached through my investment advisor about a distressed capital situation. The firm's 2 founding partners needed a quiet infusion, or they were going to have to restructure. I put in a substantial sum. I took a 43% ownership stake. I did not tell Derek. I did not tell anyone. I became, on paper, a holding company with a boring name. Derek got a promotion within 8 months of my investment, which I am told was related to the company's renewed stability, and which Derek attributed entirely to his own performance. I am sure his performance was fine. There was the house situation, which Walter laid out with the care it deserved. 4 years ago, Derek and Cassandra wanted to buy a home in a neighborhood that was slightly out of reach for their income at the time. Cassandra had sent me a long email about square footage and school districts and the importance of establishing the right foundation. I had a conversation with their mortgage broker, whom I knew professionally, and quietly arranged for a second guarantor situation that lowered their rate and made the purchase possible. The second guarantor was a holding company. The holding company is mine. There is paperwork. There was Derek's car, a lease that I had been subsidizing through an arrangement with the dealership's financing arm, $220 a month, that simply appeared as a credit and that Derek had never once questioned. There was the monthly transfer of $3,000 that went into an account Derek believed was a legacy distribution from his grandfather's estate. His grandfather's estate was resolved entirely in 2003. The transfers came from me. I had been giving my son approximately $4,100 a month, not counting the Crestline ownership and its implications, for the better part of 4 years. He had used some of it to buy the Bordeaux he drank, while calling me an embarrassment. I sat in Walter's office and I listened to all of it laid out in order, and I did not feel angry in the hot, immediate way. I felt something colder and more deliberate. I felt the specific clarity that comes when you stop lying to yourself about something important. I told Walter to start with the monthly transfers. Stop them. Effective immediately. Send a letter to the account explaining that the estate distribution had reached its scheduled conclusion. Keep it clean and simple. Walter made a note. I told him to contact the dealership's financing arm and let them know the subsidy arrangement would not be renewed at the next cycle, which was in 22 days. Walter made another note. Then I told him I wanted to review my position at Crestline Group. I told him I wanted to understand what the board's options were regarding certain structural changes I had been considering for some time. I told him I thought it was perhaps time I took a more active interest in the company's direction. Walter looked at me over his glasses for a moment. He has known me for 21 years. He said, "How active?" I said, "Start by requesting an emergency board review of the senior director positions. Performance metrics. I want everything on paper." Walter said he would have the request filed by end of day. I drove home in my Subaru. I stopped at the grocery store. I bought ingredients for the white chicken chili I make in the winter, and I went home and I made it, and I ate dinner alone at my kitchen table and listened to Coltrane on the record player in the other room, and I thought that it had been a long time since a Tuesday evening had felt quite so settled. The car situation resolved itself first, the way the smallest things always do. On day 19, Derek called me. I was in the middle of rereading a technical journal article, and I let it ring twice before I answered. He said, "Dad, there's something weird going on with my lease. They're saying the rate is going back up." I said, "Oh, that's a shame." He said, "By $220 a month." I said, "Cars are expensive." There was a pause. He said, "Do you know anything about this?" I said I wasn't sure what he meant, and I was very careful to make my voice sound exactly the way it always sounds, which is the voice of a retired engineer in Westerville who mows his own lawn. He made some noise about calling the dealership and looking into it, and I told him I was sure he'd figure it out, and I wished him a good afternoon and hung up. The monthly transfer situation reached him 4 days after that. He called again, and this time his voice had a different texture to it, something tighter, like a wire drawn an inch too far. He said the estate distribution had stopped. I told him I had received the same letter from the estate administrator, which was true, because I had instructed Walter to send a copy to my own address as well, just to keep things consistent. Derek said, "But that money, I was counting on that every month." I said, "For what?" He did not answer right away. I waited. He said, "Just expenses." I said, "I think you'd better take a look at your budget, son." He did not call me back that day. The Crestline situation took a little longer, because these things have processes, and the processes have to be respected. Walter filed the board review request through the holding company in the 3rd week of January. The other major shareholders, there are 2, both of them quiet people who had done their homework on the company before investing, were supportive of a performance review. This is the kind of thing that boards do, and it is completely routine, and there is nothing anyone can say about it that is anything other than standard corporate governance. Derek's performance review took 11 days. I did not participate in it directly. I had people who handled that kind of work. What I was told, at the conclusion of the review, was that the Senior Director of Brand Strategy position had been identified as a restructuring opportunity. The role would be redefined. The current compensation structure was not aligned with the redefined responsibilities. Derek was offered a choice, a lateral move at a significantly reduced salary, or a separation package. He chose the separation package. He called me from the parking lot of the Crestline building. I know it was the parking lot because I could hear the January wind through the phone. He said, "Dad, I just got let go." I said, "I'm so sorry, Derek. That's a hard thing." He said, "I don't understand it. Everything was going fine. Everything was good." I said, "These things happen in business. You know that." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I come over this weekend? I need to talk to you." I said, "Of course. I want to be very honest with you here, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering by this point in the story." When Derek came over that Saturday, he looked like a man who had aged 5 years in 3 weeks. He sat at my kitchen table, the same kitchen table where I had eaten my chicken chili, and he told me about the job and the lease increase and the estate money stopping, and how Cassandra was struggling to understand how. Everything had shifted so fast, and I sat across from him and I listened, and I did not say anything that was not true. I said the job market was difficult. I said that budgeting through a transition was important. I said that Cassandra was smart and capable, and I was sure they would figure it out. I did not tell him what I knew. I did not tell him any of it. I want to be honest about why. It was not cruelty. It was something I have been trying to name correctly for a long time now, and the word I keep arriving at is accountability. I had given my son a life with no real walls. I had removed every financial consequence from every decision he had ever made. I had let him believe that comfort was his natural state rather than something I was quietly manufacturing for him. And I had done this because I loved him and because loving someone the wrong way for long enough feels exactly like loving them the right way until the moment it doesn't. He needed to feel the walls. He needed to understand that the ground under him had not been solid concrete all along, it had been my hands. He left that afternoon, and I watched his car back out of my driveway. The car that now cost him $220 more per month than it had cost him a month ago, and I stood at my front window with my hands in my pockets. The Patricia call came in the first week of February. I was in the garage reorganizing some shelves when my phone rang, and her name appeared on the screen, and I stood there in my garage for a moment looking at it. We had not spoken since Christmas. We rarely spoke in the general run of things. I answered. She said, "Martin." Her voice was the particular version of Patricia's voice that meant she was managing something, and the management was not going well. "I need you to talk to Derek." I said, "About what?" She said, "He's in trouble. Real trouble. They may lose the house." I said, "What do you mean?" She explained it quickly, the way she explained things when she was upset, too much information in not enough sentences. The mortgage guarantor arrangement had been reviewed. There was a clause. There was something about a performance trigger tied to the guarantor's discretion. The lender had sent a notice. The payments were restructured. Derek and Cassandra could not cover the new payment with his severance and her income combined. I listened to all of it. I said, "That sounds very serious." Patricia said, "Martin, I need you to help him. And here's the moment. Here is the thing I have thought about more than anything else in this entire sequence of events." I said, "Patricia, why is this my responsibility?" She was quiet. I said, "He has a stepfather who works a room. He has a stepfather with connections that matter. He has a stepfather who knows how to show up to a company gala." I kept my voice completely even. "I'm kind of an embarrassment to bring anywhere. Remember?" She said, "That's not fair." I said, "No, it isn't." She said, "Martin, he's your son." I said, "I know he's my son. That's why I've been paying for his life for 4 years without being asked and without any acknowledgement from anyone in that family. That's why I arranged for his house. That's why his lease was manageable. That's why the estate money appeared every month." The silence on her end was very complete. I said, "He doesn't know any of that. You don't know any of that. Victor doesn't know any of that. And I want you to think very carefully about why none of you ever thought to ask." Patricia said quietly, "What do you mean you arranged for the house?" I told her. I told her about the guarantor. I told her about the lease subsidy. I told her about the monthly transfers. I told her about Crestline Group and the holding company and the 43% stake and the performance review. I told her everything, in order, without drama, the way you read a balance sheet aloud. When I finished, she said nothing for a long time. I said, "I'm not going to watch him starve, Patricia. I'm his father. But I am also not going to keep building a floor under someone who doesn't know the floor exists and doesn't think to be grateful for it. That's not helping him. I've been doing that for 4 years, and look what it made." She said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want my son to call me. Not because he needs money, because he understands something." She said, "You're asking a lot." I said, "I know." Derek called me 3 days later. It was a Tuesday evening, almost 8 o'clock, and I was reading in the chair by the window when my phone lit up with his name. He said, "Dad." I said, "Hey, son." He said, "Mom told me." I said, "I thought she might." He was quiet. Then he said, "How long?" I said, The transfers started in 2020. The Crestline investment was 2017. The house arrangement was 2021. He said, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I said, "Because I thought that if you knew, it would change what you were building. I wanted you to think it was yours." He said, "But it wasn't." I said, "Some of it was yours. You worked. You showed up. You're good at what you do, Derek. You have always been good at it. The company grew under your division." I paused. "But you built on land that I owned, and I should have told you that. I made a mistake by not telling you." He said, "I called you an embarrassment in front of everyone." I said, "I remember." He said, "I didn't know." I said, "That's the problem, son. You should have known that the kind of man your father is doesn't change based on what car he drives or whether he fits in at a gala. You knew who I was your whole life. You knew how I operated. You let other people rewrite what that meant, and you didn't push back." He said nothing. I said, "I love you. I have loved you since the day you were born, and that's not complicated, and it's not going to change. But I need you to understand something. The floor you've been standing on, I put it there. And I'm not sure I did you any favors by doing it quietly." He said, "What happens now?" I said, "Now you figure some things out. You've got a separation package. Cassandra works. You have savings, real ones, that I didn't touch, money you both earned. The house situation has options. Walter can walk you through them. It doesn't have to mean losing it." He said, "Are you going to help us?" I said, "I'm going to be your father. That means something different than what it meant before. It means I'll be honest with you. It means I'll be here. It doesn't mean I'll stand behind you keeping the lights on while you pretend to everyone at dinner that they're on because you flipped the switch." There was a long pause. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm sorry. For Christmas. For all of it. I think I've been performing for Cassandra and for Victor, and I think I forgot." He stopped. "I forgot what actually mattered." I said, "I know." He said, "Can I come over this week? Just to talk?" I said, "Thursday. I'll make the chili." He said he'd be there at 6. I want to tell you what Thursday looked like, because I think it is the most important part of this story, even though it is the quietest. He showed up at 5:58, which is something he has done his whole life, never quite exactly on time, but close enough that, he was trying. He came in without Cassandra, just himself, and he sat at my kitchen table while I finished the chili. And he looked around the house the way you look at something you thought you understood when you realize you might not have. He said, "You've had these same dishes since I was 12. I said, "They work fine." He said, "I always thought you just couldn't afford new ones." I said, "I know." He said, "That seems so stupid now." I said, "Not stupid, just how you were looking at things." We ate and talked the way we used to when he was younger, before Cassandra and Victor and the gala circuit and the Bordeaux, back when he was a kid who wanted to know how engines worked and why some bridges stayed up for centuries and others didn't. He asked about my patents. He asked how the investment model worked. He asked questions I had waited years for him to ask. Real questions, the kind that meant he was thinking rather than performing. At one point he said, "Did Victor know when he made those comments about you never pushing yourself?" I said, "Victor knows what he knows, which is how to run a steakhouse and how to wear a suit. That's genuinely not nothing. But no, Victor has no idea." Derek looked at the table for a moment. Then he almost laughed. "He's going to be so embarrassed." I said, "That's not my concern." Derek said, "It kind of is, though, in a small way." He looked at me. "Does that make you, is that part of why you?" I said, "No." And I meant it. I did not restructure your life to embarrass Victor Calloway. I restructured your life because I needed you to be able to stand up without my hands under your feet. That's it. He nodded slowly. He said, "What about Crestline? Is there a path back?" I said, "There's a conversation to be had. A real one, where you know who I am and I know you understand what that means. Not before that." He said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." He helped me with the dishes the way he used to when he was a teenager. And then he put on his coat and I walked him to the door, and he stood there for a second on my front porch in the February cold, looking like my son again, the version of him that existed before he decided that looking impressive mattered more than being real. He said, "Thanks, Dad." I said, "Come back next Thursday if you want. I'll make something different." He said he would. I stood at the door and watched his car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street, and I turned off the porch light and went inside. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the street where there was no snow anymore, just the gray February pavement under the streetlights, and I thought about what I had gotten right and what I had gotten wrong, and which of those things was going to be harder to carry. I had gotten wrong the part where I built the floor and said nothing. I had gotten wrong the years of watching him drift toward a version of success that was all surface, and saying nothing because I told myself he'd find his way. I had gotten wrong the specific arrogance of thinking I could protect him from consequences, and that protection would make him strong. What I had gotten right, and I say this not to congratulate myself, but because I think it's important to see clearly what I had gotten right, was knowing that the moment at that Christmas table, the moment when he looked at me across a room full of people and decided I was worth nothing, was not a moment to react. It was a moment to calculate. It was a moment to understand finally what I had made and what I needed to stop making and what needed to begin instead. 63 years old, and I am still learning how to be a father. I suspect that is how it goes. There is no clean ending to this. There is a son who is going to have to rebuild things, professionally and otherwise, and a daughter-in-law who is going through something uncomfortable and necessary, and an ex-wife who has not yet figured out how to look at me without recalibrating everything she thought she understood, and a Victor who still does not know, and who I think on balance does not need to know, because Victor is not the point. There is a Thursday evening that is going to happen again this week, and the week after, and probably for a long time. 2 people sitting at a kitchen table with bowls of something warm, talking the way people talk when they have stopped pretending. I do not need the gold watch. I do not need the Cadillac, or the gala, or the chandeliers, or the acknowledgement. I needed my son to see me. Just see me, clearly, without all the noise about what success is supposed to look like from the outside. He is starting to. That is enough for now. That is honestly more than I expected. I finished my bourbon. I turned off the lamp by the window. I went to bed in my 3-bedroom colonial in Westerville, Ohio, and outside the streetlights were steady in the February dark, and the house was quiet, and I was fine. I have always been fine. The people in my life are only now beginning to understand what that means.